We're going to jump right in.
We're back
to the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We had a little bit of a hiatus.
We did.
We played Roblox and then we just disappeared.
Yeah. And it was a formative moment in my life.
Wow.
Where I realized that I apparently don't know how to dress for a date.
I feel like I learned that I don't know how to dress for a date, which I feel like
true,
is like,
because I got voted higher than you actually.
Yeah, which is like a lot more shaking to like my identity than I feel like it is.
That's true. I knew that before I played the game.
Yeah.
So
like I've done a lot of like personal reflection since then.
Well, I was like this today when I was coming to work, I was getting shoes on and like put shoes on, and William was putting on these like blue cool kids running shoes.
Mm-hmm.
And he looked at my shoes and he's like, "Your shoes aren't very cool, Dad. Why aren't they cool?" And I was like, "Oh, well, should I wear different shoes?" He's like, "Yeah, wear these ones." I was like, "Okay." And in my mind, I was like, of all the people that try to please with my dress, why not my son? Like, what a better person.
Oh, that's wholesome.
It's just a fun, yeah. But then I was like thinking of that. Yeah. Well, I'm going to jump in. Our topic, we're talking about free will, and which will be fun.
Do you have a little story?
Yeah, I've long thought about free will. So this will be a fun conversation.
Okay, great.
I'm guessing other people have too. It's not like a random topic that people don't think about. So this morning I was working on the teaching, was thinking about one of the other podcasts, went to go look at it for some reason, hopped on YouTube, which I like barely go on because I'm a millennial. I guess millennials go on YouTube. I don't know why.
You don't go on YouTube a lot?
Barely. I don't know.
That's surprising to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I went on and I was like going to go to our page to look at the videos that we had published to so I could talk about them to students. And I got on, and of course there's like a short, and I'm like finally experiencing what everybody else who's on apps and everything all the time experiences. So
you were doing this on your phone?
No, I was on.
Okay.
Well, just in general.
Okay.
The idea of like going to something and all of a sudden you get distracted and you have no idea what you're doing.
Yeah.
I have tried to like rid most of those things out of my life. And so when they happen, I'm very like keenly aware that it happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I like jumped on, and there were like some YouTube shorts, and so I ended up watching one because it was on free will. And then all of a sudden, I'm like, okay, I don't want to get distracted. I exited out, went back to my teaching. I was like, why was I on YouTube? Oh, right. And then went back to YouTube to do what I was supposed to do.
Yeah.
So it was interesting. Yeah. And so the video, it was a short, and I don't know enough to know. I don't even know what that
This is
means.
like Justin's first exposure to
shorts. Well, I intentionally
TikTok
avoid
style content.
I intentionally avoid short form entertainment because I know that it's bad for me.
Mm-hmm.
Like I know that it's bad for my brain and the way I think, and that long form conversation and discussion is better. So it was a guy. It was like a clickbaity thing where a girl gets like basically says, "I can't believe in a God who would let people choose and go to hell. Like, why would a God do that?" And the guy responds with, "Well, if somebody kidnapped you right now and put you in a basement and made them marry you, would that be loving?" And she's like, "No." And he's like, "So what if someone wooed you and married you? Would that be loving?" And she's like, "Yes." He's like, "Well, that's what God does to it." Like, it was the free will argument for the garden. This is a very interesting, all while seemingly not choosing to watch that video.
Yeah.
So that's always like the interesting thing in the back of my mind.
Yeah. Your algorithm knew that what would suck you in is religious apologetic owning other people content.
Specifically on the topic of the podcast today.
Yeah, of free will.
Like, how could it have gotten any better than a title of video with free will is the only word on that video.
Crazy. Scary stuff.
They're listening.
They're watching. They're listening. Yeah, but we this past Wednesday talked about the Exodus, or as we renamed it. Are we allowed to rename something in the Bible?
We didn't. The Exodus. I feel like that's a pretty big
we're not
name.
Renaming it. We gave it a different framing.
A title.
Yeah. We called it the Rescue, which is still an accurate description of what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we kind of took on slightly different angles.
Yeah.
To the story a little bit. I was in junior high and I talked about sin and essentially fear and jealousy and pride ruling over kind of Pharaoh and the Egyptians, and that kind of spiraling out of control in the way that they treat the Israelites. And then by contrast, the Israelites trust and obey God. We looked at the Passover story to illustrate that. And where the Egyptians being ruled by sin and fear and pride, it ultimately leads to their death. But where the Israelites trust and obey God, because of that, they are rescued from death and rescued into freedom from slavery.
Yeah, I took don't disagree with it. It's interesting passages that you can like focus, and it's like such a big span.
It's a big swath of text. Yeah.
Well, I talked a lot more about one, just the oddness of the story, about what the plagues are and the fact that the magicians of the Egyptians are able to do things as well. And so what that tells us about the spiritual world that we live in. And then I specifically go to how the Exodus story is about Yahweh being greater than any Egyptian god. And so that who Israel worships is greater than who Egypt worships. And then led that to how the Exodus or the rescue is this community forming event. And that it's an event that I'm going to have a quote that I find really intriguing that maybe students do. But it's from a Jew talking about how the Passover or the Exodus is the most important historical event in all of history. And even says like other religions and movements and things like owe to the Exodus. And part of what they say is that it's an ongoing, like it's meant to be lived over and over and over again through the Passover. And then talking about how we talk a lot about choices, but how we also have this theme in the Bible of being rescued from sin and slavery. And so oftentimes in our brand or stream of Christianity, we talk more about our choices lead us to hell, but we don't talk as much about the effects of what other people do that hurt us. So that we're freed from that as well and rescued from it. So
yeah.
Which all relates to free will.
Yeah. So one of the
do you have a direction for this conversation?
Kind of, not really.
Oh, okay.
But just as a starting off point, in how we decided to talk about free will, or I guess I decided that we were going to talk about free will, is because...
Did you? No, just kidding.
I don't know. We'll explore that maybe. But in the story of the Exodus, there are like a couple verses that I know when I remember like reading these in college for the, like, probably not for the first time, but like sitting with them in a way that like were really alarming to me. Because I mean, the Exodus is an intense story. There is violence and bloodshed and a lot of people die. So it's not a low stakes. This is not a low stakes story by any means. So to read a verse, like it happens a couple times throughout the narrative.
Like chapter 7.
Yeah, or I'm in chapter 4 right now too. The Lord said to Moses, when you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. That's in 4:21. And there's a similar reiteration of that in 7 as well. But I think reading that and thinking about the outcome of what happens to the Egyptians, I think from a modern framework and standpoint, it can be really like confusing to look at that and say, oh, well, did all those people die just because God chose to harden Pharaoh's heart? Like, did Pharaoh even actually have a choice in this whole like narrative that plays out? And I think the narrative actually does answer that, but it also opens up into like a much broader question of, we believe in a God who is all powerful and all knowing. So how does that interplay with free will and the choices that we get to make as humans? There, I set it up. You have lots of thoughts.
I do have lots of thoughts. So I come from a philosophy background to where most philosophers, I shouldn't say most philosophers, in a secular philosophy world, you're going to be hard pressed to find a lot of philosophers that believe in free will at all. And so I'd say like my main thinking throughout most of my life has been, there are two factors when it comes to your decisions, your biology and your environment, and you chose neither of those. And so what choice could you possibly make that isn't, I think we've talked about this even some before, of how can you choose what your favorite color is when, like, how do you decide what your brain finds pleasurable? Like, it's just like, it's such a basic thing. But even food, of like, do you really choose what your favorite food is? Or is it that your brain and the way that your tongue is created likes certain things? Like the fact that I don't like ice cream and you do like ice cream. How much of that is even our own choice? Or is it, like, why would I like something that I don't find flavorful? But it's not that I've like decided I don't find it that great. That the way my body is just doesn't enjoy it. Like my brain doesn't, I don't know.
Yeah.
So,
and most secular philosophers would like expand that knowledge or that logic, I guess, to any other decision that we make in life, that it really is, we're just, I don't know.
Yeah.
Biological creatures operating out of what's
our
shaped
biology.
us and formed us. Yeah.
And Sam Harris is one of the most prominent atheist philosophers. And he has an analogy where he explains, say a serial killer, there's a psychopathic serial killer and he kills someone and they're trying to administer justice. But while they're, going through the case, they find a tumor in his brain, and a tumor is right on the location of the brain that would explain all of these violent tendencies and the desire to kill. Everybody suddenly would morally switch and go, oh, like the tumor's to blame. Like he didn't, like on his own wouldn't have chosen to do that, but because there's this tumor. And then imagine you take the tumor out and the guy's this like super pleasant guy and was so ashamed and sorry that he did it. And his point, he says, is when it's that obvious, we all make that moral switch. But how is our brain, like chemistry, any different than that obvious example? Like how can we get into our brain and understand, was Pharaoh wired to be the way he was by the way God made him? I mean, Sam Harris would never say by the way God made him.
Right.
The way that chance made him. But yeah, when you take that like obvious example, or even like in our modern day meds, like when people are on meds, anybody who's been on medication for any reason knows how much it can shift your personality and your experience of life. And it can be startling when you are operating a certain way and experiencing life a certain way. You start medication and then it shifts, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And I think most of us at this point have probably seen that in ourselves or in someone else. But how is that any different than just being born with the other type of, like, how is that any different? And how is that a choice that you make? So if you're born with a biology and a chemistry that says, that like gives you a bleak disposition towards the world that ends up being angry or bitter or wanting vengeance, like, yeah. So that's the, like, are you wondering, like, so where are you going to go with this?
Well, yeah, because I think then, because I think a lot of people make that argument even for things like, and where you were just going with right now, I think, like, it's not uncommon to hear, especially when it comes to conversations about, like, sexuality, like, well, God made me this way. Yeah. So, like, and in a sense, that is kind of shifting moral agency / free will and free choice away from yourself. But yeah.
Well, it's weird. I don't think they. I think that comes before what I was talking about, because I don't think somebody goes like, oh, a serial killer. Like they wouldn't start there and go like, a serial killer's not in charge of their actions, just like me.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't mean to make that comparison.
No, it's more that they wouldn't. I think somebody who's trying to argue that your sexual orientation is not your choice wouldn't argue that a killer wasn't. Like they would be like, how could you compare those two things?
Yeah.
So I think even in those situations, you see this weird, like, why wouldn't they be different? Like, we're not trying to say that being gay and killing people are the same. That's not all we're trying to say. But why would you separate those as distinct? Like, one of those you don't get to choose, but the other one you do? How does that make any sense? Does that mean, like...
Right.
And then the same of being a Christian, not being a Christian, doing the morally right thing ever. And so it all goes back to, like, so then how do we actually make decisions? So I struggle in general with believing in free will, partially because of the word free. I think I've talked to you about that before.
Yeah. What's the word you use instead?
I prefer meaningful.
Meaningful, yeah.
Meaningful will or meaningful choice. Because I don't know if the Bible affirms a free will. I think the story of Pharaoh actually muddies the water about what a choice is and what choices were given. But I think it still affirms a responsibility of our choices, which I think means we have a meaningful will. And that's what's like gets so confusing about free will, because it's hard to separate out where do you begin and end. So again, from like a philosophy perspective, they would say, you don't know the next thought you're going to have. Your thoughts just kind of appear. And if you did know the next thought you're going to have, you would have to be the one to think it. But then how would you get that thought that you have? Like, where do your thoughts come from? And you start digging into like your own brain. You're like, I don't know. Like,
welcome our teenage students listening to this. We are in like college level, high level.
Yeah, that's true. Maybe even beyond high level. Yeah, that's very true.
Course knowledge right now.
Yeah. But like still, if you just sit there for a little bit and think, you'll try to, when you try to separate out, then how do I make the decisions I make? It gets really murky really fast. And so all of a sudden, I think we get to this point where it's one of those times where you're almost looking so closely at something that it stops being what it is. So I guess all that to say, I think when you talk about free will, there's like a level of microscope that you can keep zooming in and in and in until all of a sudden you're not even having a meaningful conversation. So when I think about the Bible and its explanation of will, I don't think it tries to get into how do our brains make a decision and is that decision based off of this or this or this. Like, it's not interested in any of that philosophical stuff. I think what it's interested in is that we have decisions that we are given and we are held responsible for those decisions.
Yeah.
And like many things, we're left with the question of, well, God, where does that come from? And that's fun to imagine or talk about, but I just don't think the Bible answers that question.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So, I guess two things are true. Like, obviously, God chooses and places us in the time and context that we're in, and that time and context forms how we think about things, what we believe, how we act, the relationships that we have. But I think the kinds of things that you're describing, I think, are like it's not a widespread intuition. Like, I think that is like a pretty ivory tower academia, like kind of like, I think if you ask the average person on the street, that's not the instinct that people are going to like move towards. Like everyone has like clearly not everyone, but like the average person has an instinctual like understanding that there is some kind of like moral responsibility and agency that they have in the choices that they make.
They definitely have that about other people. I think that's like C.S. Lewis's point where like that inherentness of fair, where like you can have somebody argue all day long that everything's subjective or like fair doesn't matter or whatever, but then as soon as somebody does something to you that's unfair, you get this like, visceral response to it. And so we all have it somewhere in us for sure.
Yes.
And I think there was a bit of time with like extreme postmodernism where it didn't exist, but I think that's already so long gone. Like I would imagine for most students that we have, most teenagers, the idea that some things or that nothing can be said to be right or wrong is like completely foreign to them. Like I feel like the moral absolute landscape is pretty strong right now. Even when we're talking about LGBTQ, like none of the conversation around LGBTQ is like, you want to make fun of somebody for who they love, go for it. Like, who's to say it's wrong? It's like, no, you have a moral responsibility to care for these people and to help them. And if somebody having an identity crisis about their sexuality is going to lead to their death because of suicide, we have a moral responsibility to help them. Like, that's the conversation.
Right.
So there's like a strong, clear moral objectivity to our current world, at least in that discussion. So, which is good.
Yeah. And I think you're right in pointing out of like, we have objectivity that we apply subjectively.
Yeah.
Which I feel like that goes back to like the conversation that we had about whether or not God is fair. And like we have a standard of fair that we apply to ourselves differently than we apply to other people. But now I feel like we're moving away from
free will.
And
decision. Well, what I was thinking about with Pharaoh and free will that's interesting is we do have this like in Exodus 4 when God says what he's going to do, that he says he's going to harden Pharaoh's heart. I'm trying to find it. Sorry, I lost it already. I was on 7. Oh, 21.
Yeah.
I'm trying to remember if he says anything before that. But what's interesting is, like, I have to put it into context that God is talking about an evil dictator who is a slave owner, and like the evilness of Pharaoh. Like, we don't get a lot about this specific Pharaoh until the story begins. We get his, I think his predecessor, who murdered children. But in general, pharaohs were incredibly evil people that ruled, that killed, that took what they wanted. So I don't want to make the mistake of assuming, oh, the story begins with this like innocent blank slate pharaoh, and then God comes and goes, I'm going to harden his heart.
Right.
And it's like, whoa, God, why are you being so mean to this nice guy?
Yeah. And I think that's where it does become like alarming, because I think culturally the baseline understanding that a lot of people have about what humanity is that like everyone just comes into the world as a blank slate. Like, like it's just a blank slate. And so for God to harden someone's heart, like that would be like a really alarming thing.
But even if Pharaoh did come in as a blank slate,
Right.
like at this point, he's probably spent 30 years of his life murdering, like manipulating,
totally.
Being awful.
Right. And I mean, I think narratively, the Exodus story does answer the question a little bit too, in a way that I think, I guess there's two things when I go to when I think about, like free will and the autonomy over the choices that we have, and one being like specifically related to this story that I think we've talked about before. But first of all, being that like God hands us over to the things that we choose. And that's very much like narratively what happens in the Exodus story with Pharaoh, is that it's kind of ambiguous at first, like who's doing the hardening of hearts, but it's not towards like almost like 10 explicit decisions where it's like it's like the last two where the Bible says explicitly, and God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Up until then, it's like it's either kind of ambiguous, it'll just say Pharaoh's heart like became hard, or it will say Pharaoh hardened his own heart. So I think that the first thing that I would say specifically about this story is that what we see happening is not God just coming in and like, like Pharaoh's a blank slate and he just hardened Pharaoh's heart. It's God just hands Pharaoh over to the path that he's already been choosing. He's already been walking down.
Yeah.
A well-worn path already.
Well, it's also interesting because if you look at what is the method by which God narratively hardens his heart, he comes and invites Pharaoh 10 different times to do the right thing with consequences and warnings and signs. That's a pretty gracious way. Like I'm probably in my teaching, I don't know if maybe I didn't talk about this, maybe I did. I think I'm going to compare the Exodus and look at the Holocaust because it's a more like, it's the Jews again with a dictator who is cruel, who's killing them. And I just imagine like the ridiculousness of going to Hitler and being like, hey, could you let the Jews go? And like giving them chance after chance after chance. Like, no, wouldn't we just go in and like take them out and free all the people? And yet God like gives Pharaoh this much time to choose to do the right thing. I just think that's like an incredibly gracious thing to a very evil person.
Well, and that's why, I mean, one of the descriptors of God over and over through the Old Testament is that he's slow to anger. And that's what a lot of these like more startling stories, it's oftentimes what they're illustrating is God's patience and the chances that he gives people.
Yeah. So do we have free will? I don't know if we answer that. I don't know where this conversation got. Like, I don't have an endpoint. I don't have a.
The second thing I want to say about this passage, though, is that I think that Pharaoh is also like a unique figure. Like I think the instance of God hardening Pharaoh's heart here, like this is a very unique person, and this is a very like once in all of the Bible story and event that is happening here. So God is accomplishing like something very specific in this moment, and it's a powerful display of his like willingness to save and rescue his people. So because of that, I don't. My point is, I don't think that we should apply the God hardening Pharaoh's heart as like a one-to-one to like ourselves or the average person.
Yeah, because then the question becomes, does God have the ability to overcome someone's will? And I think you'd have to answer yes. Like he could overcome someone's own will. And so doing that once doesn't mean he does that always.
Right.
So,
yes.
Yeah, I think it's like the inverse of Saul, where it's like, how much choice does Saul really have? I mean, if Jesus shows up on a road talking to you, I don't know. I guess you still.
That's
sorry,
Saul.
Saul and Paul.
I was like,
to Paul.
Saul.
That's Saul. Yeah. Very different decision. Which I guess you could. Like, I mean, Richard Dawkins has famously said, even if a vision of God appeared, I would not become a Christian because he is so skeptical and sees Christians as so manipulative that he wouldn't be able to trust that it wasn't some group of Christians some way trying to manipulate his senses to like have an experience that would then, like he literally said, if on my deathbed I said it, don't believe it. Like I've been manipulated, I've been tricked, it's not.
Wow.
Which is like, that's that's such a strong rejection of who God is.
Yeah.
To say like there is no circumstance, and if you ever hear it, it's a lie, it's a trick, they're trying to like make me into a martyr for their cause. That's not true. I'm like, I was just amazed to hear somebody say, even if I saw God, I would not believe it.
Yeah. Wow.
So yeah, I don't sorry.
Yeah.
Kind of a weird random tangent, but
yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I think why we make the choices we make, I think what it does do, like when I think about meaningful will rather than free will, and acknowledge some of the, it's even part of the conversation tonight for me, is we've spent so much time talking about choice. And I think when we talk about salvation and forgiveness, we spend so much time talking about humans as sinners, as our own culpability, the bad things we do. And what we sometimes leave completely out of the conversation is the things done to us and how that shapes us.
Right.
And you think about, somebody who, I was even thinking this morning, like around Melissa, my wife, William and Lincoln, my two boys, and how the things that Melissa and I do are so governed by how our parents were. And now the things our kids do are so governed by who we are. And like, yes, we have choices, and I have moments where I choose good and choose bad about what I'm going to do. But goodness, I didn't choose the way I was brought up or the patterns I saw.
Yeah.
So there's I think a graciousness for myself and for others, where you then begin to understand. You can ask the question, like, whoa, what's causing that? What's making that happen? Where's that coming from? And sometimes it is a person's choice. That's what was even interesting as I was and as I have read atheist or secular philosophers about free will. Even the question I said, which the speaker, I heard a speaker say, which was like, you don't even know your next thought coming. You're not choosing what to think.
Mm-hmm.
My mind is like, well, there are times I intentionally choose.
Yeah.
Where I say, like, oh, I'm frustrated at this person, but you know what? Like, I'm going to make a conscious choice to think about their life, to consider, to ask better questions, to forgive them and care about them, even if I don't necessarily want to.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that, at least in my own brain, feels like a conscious choice. So I feel like it is like both of those things coming together, that we have all these influences in our life, but we also get the moments of decision that matter.
Yeah.
Or a counterexample I heard someone say was, one of the famous experiments they did was they put somebody in front of a clock, and they had them wired up with a brain thing. And they said, like, choose to raise your right hand or your left hand, and then tell us when you decided. And basically the brain scans show that your brain knows before you know which one you're going to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which they then take that to mean you don't actually choose, your brain chooses. But then the question's like, well, aren't you your brain? Like, just because you're not consciously aware of it. If that's like the firing mechanism, it's like, seems. But the big point of it that they were countering with was, to raise your right or left hand doesn't seem to have any like weight one way or the other. Like, that seems like a decision that free will could relatively easily come into, of like, what family upbringing, or, what thing is forcing you to pick one over the other. I feel like other things we can trace it back to, like, oh, if I get passive aggressive, like, I probably learned that behavior from my parents, and I probably decided at many points to continue that behavior. And so now I have that behavior, and it's a pattern.
Right. Yeah.
But right or left, like, who cares?
Yeah. And I mean, that's exactly, I know I talk about this book all the time, and it's kind of annoying probably, but You Are What You Love. Like, that's exactly that
just makes me think I need to read it every time you talk about it. Like, oh, why haven't I read it yet?
That's like essentially the argument that he makes is that, like, in a lot of ways we are like governed by impulses, like, rather than like conscious, like it's not that we don't have any moments like that where we make like a conscience, like, okay, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do this because I've been so well informed by X, Y, and Z facts, and no other emotional bias informed how I interpret any. Like, we're the decisions that we make are informed by what has shaped us. So the author's argument is essentially to put habits in your life that will shape you to look more like Jesus. So that way, when you are faced with a decision that maybe you're not even like,
don't realize is a decision.
Yes. Like, your instinct will be to choose the way of Jesus. But that takes, like, there's a decision in that. Like, there's a decision in forming patterns and habits that help you in those, like, subconscious moments of how am I going to react, or what am I going to decide?
Which I think is meaningful will.
Yes.
You have decisions, but there's a lot that factors into those decisions.
Yes. Yeah. And
Hmm.
I also don't want to like undermine that as Christians, like obviously we believe that like dramatic life change can and like does happen. Like
Mhm.
like choosing to follow Jesus and being transformed for many people is often it's a slow drip. Like it's something that slowly you're formed and shaped into. But we also don't want to undermine the fact that Saul to Paul
Mm-hmm.
moments can and do happen. Like
Yep.
and Saul to Paul is like one of like the biggest and maybe most dramatic things that we could point to. But
But it's a pretty big pattern. Like I feel like Saul to Paul is meant to be an example, and it's a pattern that has repeated throughout history.
Yes. And I think that for a lot of people, you can like point to moments in your life that are maybe not quite as dramatic, but feel really dramatic in the sense of like, oh, like I just had this Jesus moment. Like I just had this encounter with God that's like, and now I'm instantly like thinking differently about something or engaging with the world differently.
And that's even where, when it comes to free will, I think when I wasn't a Christian, I was more adamantly determinist, which determinism just means you don't make choices. Your choices are determined by your biology and your circumstances or your environment. And I think the introduction of an immaterial world then shifts that, because then at least allows the option of either something about ourselves, like I have no idea how much of us is our biology, how much is some immaterial soul or essence. I'm like, I don't know. One, I'm not smart enough. Two, I'm not nearly educated enough to understand that. And three, I don't think that there's a conclusive answer.
Yeah, I don't think anyone
Bible.
is smart enough to parse that out.
There's still a lot smarter people that could at least guess or, think about it or whatever.
Maybe,
talk about it. Yeah, definitely more than me, and definitely more educated. But it, at least for me, gives me the pause of, well, there's something, which is even the point of the Egyptian magicians. There's something more to our reality than just what we can observe and know. So there's maybe like a humility in whether or not what we get to decide and what we don't, which is what we see in the stories. An immaterial God affecting a material person. Yeah. To make a decision. But yeah. But I think, because I think these conversations too can feel very like you said, ivory tower, or very like 10,000 feet. Like, okay, that's a fun conversation, but what does it mean? But I do think the real practical pieces for me are, one, the graciousness with myself and others, to recognize that free will is maybe not so free. And so when people make decisions, including yourself, to examine and consider what is behind those decisions, and how can I have empathy and care for the people who made a decision that maybe really hurt me or maybe bothers me, including myself. But then also, the other side of it is that I do still have choices. And so what am I going to do with those choices? And trying to even identify in my own mind, when have I made a choice and when did I get carried away by a habit or pattern? And what choice can I make to then change that habit or pattern?
Right.
And I think, there's even, I try to have a different level of, that was really loud.
Sorry, that was bad.
Gabby okay, tangent. I've always wondered, can you break your own neck by snapping it?
I hope not.
Have you thought about that when you're doing it? Like sometimes I'm like cracking my own neck and I'm like, what if that's how I was found dead? Like I was cracking my own neck and I don't know.
Elijah says that to me all the time.
That like one day you'll just die from cracking your own neck.
Yeah.
I think about it, way too often. What a dumb way to die. I was talking about, of having like a different level of grace for myself when I realized like, this has become a habit or pattern in my life, or even like sometimes they can get to like, so maybe some of you are in something you'd call an addiction, which I would just say is like an extreme form of a pattern or habit. And sometimes it can even be a like chemical addiction, which then is a whole nother step. And so again, it's a gradient. But I think when I found myself in a pattern, to have a different level of grace for myself and say, okay, like this decision here, I'm realizing I didn't actually really make the decision, but I did make a decision earlier that got me into this mess.
Right. Yep.
So it's not that I'm like not culpable for that moment, but not piling it on and going, okay, so what can I do to start building towards better habits that will help me? So I think that just helps especially when you get caught in some kind of a downward spiral, or I think we all have habitual sins that change throughout every moment of like, I feel like every stage of my life has had different things where I realize, that's a pattern sin. That's not just a thing I do. That's something I do often, but yeah. don't know if you have any like practical or like boots hitting the ground. I guess this is a hand hitting a table, but
no, I think you covered it pretty well. Yeah, I think the empathy piece is where I would land really strongly too. And not, like we never want to shy away from the responsibility that we do have. Like, I always like roll my eyes when I'm like, when someone is confronted with like, oh, well, like you seem to do this thing over and over again. And like when someone is like, well, that's just the way that I am. It's like, well.
What's the like current phrase people use? My intrusive thoughts or whatever.
That's just my intrusive thoughts. Yeah.
Well,
Well, it's like, well, okay, but now someone has pointed it out to you. So now you actually do have some kind of like moral culpability in it now. So you like, I'm not saying that it'll be easy, but like you do have some kind of responsibility to like take an action step towards making a change. But I think recognizing and empathizing, and this is going to sound hypocritical because I just did this exact same thing, but instead of like, we don't want to use that knowledge to like look out at other people. We want to use that knowledge to like reflect inwardly on ourselves. So instead of saying like, oh, well, I don't care if that person has like a habit or a habitual thing, or like has been in an environment that it's like really difficult for them to not act that way. I'm like, they still shouldn't act that way. So I don't care, and I'm going to be mad at them anyway. It's like, well, we want to exercise like empathy and understand that, okay, it's really hard to make a change. And anyone recognizes that, because when you try to make a change in your own life, it frequently does not happen overnight.
Thus the joke of New Year's resolutions.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah. No, Elijah and I have already failed our screen time New Year's resolution. So, yeah.
You can be like me and just decide that they're not worth it. I don't want to be disappointed end of January. It's already depressing enough.
No, but that's but that's where I feel like that is the like
do you give up?
The catastrophizing of, not catastrophizing, but the like, oh, we didn't make it, so now we flush it all down the toilet. It's like, no, actually, I still believe in like the goal that we set, and I still think that it's worth striving towards. And
you can still reset the goal and reconsider.
Yeah, and that's the kind of grace we have to know that like God extends to us when we're in the middle of trying to reform, reshape a habit, a pattern that we're in that we know isn't what He wants for us. So that's the kind of grace that we have to like operate out of, and not let it like a mistake or a failure pile on and I don't know, ruin everything.
Yeah. That's good.
Yeah. Okay.
So, make good, meaningful decisions with the choices that you do have, and recognize when you're carried away in a pattern, and what decisions or maybe even circumstances led you there.
Yep. So. Yeah. And ask for help when you need it too.
Yeah, from people and from God.
Yep. Yeah.
Cool.
Wow, we solved free will.
We did. We solved it by saying that no one can solve it.
Yeah.
Job done.
No, but you can take meaningful steps towards it.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we will see you junior high. We'll see you at Skate City.
Yes. On
Wednesday, the 29th from 6:30 to 8:30. Senior high, you'll be off campus, so we'll miss you, but we'll see you in February. Bye.
Bye.